he writes this, and a bunch of guys go off on him. Many of them are pastors, many of them are philosophers and professors, and they take him. The typical view is that his argument is rather circular. What typical writers like C.S. Lewis would be probably the best and most read example.
Bringing C.S. Lewis back to the table again. All right, let's do this. Welcome back to Anchorless, where we challenge assumptions with logic and dig deep into the foundations of belief. In today's video, we're going to be responding to an interview between Christian apologist Frank Turek and top New Testament scholar Gary Habermas, going over why Hume's argument for miracles supposedly runs into circularity, and briefly examine why the stolen body theory fails for the empty tomb. For those of you who aren't aware, Gary Habermas is considered to be the top-notch expert on the resurrection of Jesus, and has been publishing his magnum opus series on the resurrection for the past year and a half. Luckily, I have both Volume 1, which goes over the evidences of the resurrection, and Volume 2, which goes over the refutations that have been presented to argue against the hypothesis. I have read quite a bit of both volumes and even have some text prepared to lay down with what corresponds with the talking points we will be addressing in the interview.
Give us, I know you've got, as you say, 100 pages on Hume, but just for our listeners who may not be familiar with Hume's basic argument against miracles, give us an overview of that, Gary, and why doesn't it work?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of responses and a lot of philosophers get involved. The essay is first of all, it's an essay, not a book. And it's a standalone essay. It's section 10 of his famous inquiry. And by the way, right after it, he has a chapter against life after death. But in the previous chapter, he's got this chapter against miracles, and he argues what the contemporary view, especially at that time. Now, maybe I should stop right there and say time out. I've got a book on my shelf of published responses to Hume from immediately after his essay was written, before the time of the American Civil War. And he writes this, and a bunch of guys go off on him. Many of them are pastors, many of them are philosophers and professors, and they take him. The typical view is that his argument is rather circular. What typical writers like C.S. Lewis would be probably the best and most read example.
Yes.
In his book Miracles. He says Lewis makes all kinds of problems. He says, for example, if there are no supernatural events in the world, then seriously, there's no supernatural events. And if you say there's no supernatural events, and you can't look at the resurrection, and Lewis says, what we've done is argue in a circle.
Hume never makes an affirmative position that miracles simply don't exist in the world. Hume was making an inductive case of comparing miracle testimony with the track record of other testimony, outweighing an event that went beyond the ordinary, and that it has far less weight of parsimony than that of which is familiar to human experience. C.S. Lewis is known among skeptics to be making this type of straw man.
Mm-hmm.
So Hume is usually seen as making a definition, ignoring it, and right away making comments against it. As soon as he defined, very famous definition, a miracle is a supernatural event brought about by God or an invisible agent. And then he says, since these things have never happened, therefore they're false.
Nope. As I've already said, that's an oversimplification and a straw man of Hume.
Here is the quote that Gary had paraphrased. I'll give it exactly. Here's what C.S. Lewis said about David Hume's argument against miracles, because David Hume was trying to say, we have a uniform experience against miracles, so therefore they can't occur. Here's how Lewis put it. He said, now, of course, we must agree with Hume that if there is an absolutely uniform experience against miracles, if in other words, they have never happened, why then they never have. Unfortunately, we know the experience against them to be uniform only if we know that all the reports of them are false. And we can only know all the reports of them to be false only if we know already that miracles have never occurred. In fact, we are arguing in a circle.
Interestingly enough, Gary goes over this in page 67 of his second volume in his magnum opus. Here he states,
C.S. Lewis agreed on the nature of these problems, recognizing this weakness and developing them into a trenchant criticism of Hume's position. Lewis relates, "Now, of course, we must agree with Hume that if there is absolutely uniform experience against miracles, if in other words they have never happened, why then they never have. Unfortunately, we know the experience against them to be uniform only if we know that all reports of them are false. And we can know all the reports to be false only if we know already that miracles have never occurred. In fact, we are arguing in a circle." Lewis has clearly noted these problems here, some of the same ones that bothered other thinkers as well. Hume can only claim that all experience affirms his view if he has first ascertained that all other experience is false. But since he has not investigated the evidence potentially favoring other positions, he can only state that they are false by assuming that miracles cannot occur. As Lewis seems to conclude fairly, Hume is reasoning circularly.
I don't see how C.S. Lewis has uncovered any circle in Hume's reasoning, and Habermas's commentary doesn't add much clarity either. When Lewis says, "We know the experience against miracles to be uniform only if we know that all reports of them are false," he's missing the mark and misrepresenting Hume's epistemology. Hume's point does not require that we must first know all the miracle reports are false in order to infer the uniformity of nature. Rather, the uniformity of nature is inferred inductively from a vast history of consistent experience, the exact same evidential mechanism by which miracle reports are assessed. But unlike miracle claims, the regularity of nature has overwhelming precedent. That makes it more parsimonious, not dogmatically assumed, to conclude that any particular miracle claim is likely false. Lewis also ignores that Hume is making a probabilistic, not absolute argument. Saying that a miracle probably didn't happen is not the same as saying it couldn't have. This is basic inductive reasoning. Lewis frames Hume's argument in black and white terms as if Hume must know with certainty that all miracles are false to infer uniformity. But that's not how empiricism works, especially in regard to testimonial evidence. We don't need absolute certainty, we need the most plausible explanation given the evidence. If anything, I could steelman Lewis's concern by recasting it as an argument from human fallibility. Many extraordinary claims, when tested, turn out false. That only reinforces Hume's point. The same mechanism that confirms the regularity of nature also shows us that human testimony, especially in religious or extraordinary contexts, is often mistaken. When Lewis says, "We can know all the reports to be false only if we know already that miracles have never occurred," he's oversimplifying. Hume isn't presupposing miracles are impossible, he's just saying that given the empirical track record, it's far more likely that a miracle report is false than that a law of nature has actually been violated. That's not circular reasoning, it's inductive skepticism grounded in experience. So no, Lewis hasn't caught Hume in a circle, he's just misunderstood the nature of the argument and slapped the label circular on it, hoping it'll stick.
Unquote. And Dr. Gary Habermas has a lot more on Hume in this second volume to point out that his argument against miracles doesn't work. And Gary, it's not just you saying this now. I know there are atheists that have written against Hume's argument and pointed out that it doesn't work against miracles. True?
I'm not caught up with the general consensus of Hume's argument amongst atheists. However, as one myself, I agree that Hume's argument doesn't necessarily debunk miracles per se. I would only argue that Hume laid down an epistemic justification to approach miracle claims like the resurrection with reasonable skepticism. Of course, skepticism doesn't really get you far in debunking anything, so if we were to take his position in this manner, I agree it's not exactly a slam dunk.
True. The best known one is Hume's Abject Failure. Seems like that was published by Oxford. I'm trying to remember. But that's an unbeliever who goes off on him. And he's not the only one. There's a number of major people. But I think what's really interesting is at that time, there were, you would think in the 1760s, let's say, there would be 2 or 3 people who would write against him. This book I was referring to has about 15 different authors that have gone off on him in journal articles and whatever. And their leading interpretation was that he argued in a circle, he defined miracles circularly.
So Habermas claims that Hume defines miracles in a circular way, as if Hume just assumes that they can't happen and then argues that they don't. But that's simply not true, and honestly it misrepresents what a definition even is. When Hume defines a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature, that's not a circular argument, that's a definitional clarification. We do this all the time. A bachelor is an unmarried man. Intelligence is a part of what we mean by smart. That's not fallacious. That's how language works. Definitions correspond to the concepts they described. They don't argue in circles. What Hume actually does is this. He starts by defining what a miracle is, a violation of natural law. Then he points out that our uniform experience is that these laws don't get violated. So, any claim of a miracle has to overcome the overwhelming prior probability that nature behaves lawfully. That's not circular, that's Bayesian reasoning. He's not saying miracles can't happen because they're miracles. He's saying when something violates the regularity of nature, the burden of proof is enormous, and most miracle claims don't meet that burden. So no, Gary, that's not circular reasoning. That's just knowing how definitions work. If you think a miracle isn't a violation of natural law, then make that case. But don't act like defining a term clearly is some kind of philosophical trap. That's like saying it's circular to define a square as having 4 equal sides. If the strongest response to Hume is he used a definition I don't like, then maybe the problem isn't Hume. Maybe the problem is your miracle claims can't stand up to basic scrutiny.
If you're going to say something, make sure you have the facts straight first.
Well, I need to say this, Gary, because I remember this like it was yesterday. It was 25 years ago. It was the year 2000. It was here in Charlotte. You were debating Antony Flew, Antony, yes, Antony, Flew, who was probably the top philosophical atheist in the world in the 20th century. Right. And he was a Hume expert. Yep. And I'll never forget this, Gary, because you were debating about the resurrection. And Flew actually said this in the debate. I'm sure you remember. Well, actually, he said it after the debate to you. Yep. Why don't you tell the story? Because you walked out of the room and told me this.
Yes. Yeah. First of all, Tony was a very good friend. He was super honest. He told me I had 3 debates with him and a couple other dialogues. He told me, he said, I don't reject miracles a priori.
I'd hope Dr. Flew wouldn't have rejected them a priori, considering that experience and events are taken into account.
But then I go on and say, there's refutations for each of the naturalistic theories. And then secondly, I think no one theory, you could push this and get kind of close, but no one theory, if it worked, could explain the resurrection data. So a third one is you need more than one theory to work. And if you have 2 probabilities, let's say you have 2 unlikely theories, and the hallucinations getting hit hard today. I'm reviewing a book right now, which is a refutation of hallucinations, very scholarly. And if naturalistic theories don't work, 2 of them that are improbable make a more improbable view.
I do agree that 2 improbable theories do add to the improbability of the entire hypothesis. However, as long as the 2 have more parsimony than an opposing hypothesis, I don't think it's as problematic as Habermas makes it to be.
Okay, so is their explanation for why they believed it hallucinations? Is that the primary one?
Well, Bart Ehrman might disagree on this, but I think in earlier works he leaned toward hallucination. In his later book, I call them for my grad students. I go by book colors. You have a lot of books on the resurrection, or a lot of books against theism. You go by colors. And in his red book, how Jesus became God, he says, I'm no longer going to take naturalistic theories. He said, I don't take them to be true. And he said, let's admit it. The disciple stealing the body is a stupid theory. This is Ehrman. Okay. He said the disciple stealing the body is a stupid theory. However, it's better than a resurrection because resurrections don't happen. It's David Hume, and he always cites Hume.
I find it adorable that Habermas doesn't consider that there are going to be skeptics who have read both of their works and can fact-check any of their bold claims about each other. Here is what Bart Ehrman actually says about the stolen body theory in his book, which can be found in page 123.
I don't subscribe to any of these alternative views because I don't think we know what happened to the body of Jesus. But simply looking at the matter from a historical point of view, any of these views is more plausible than the claim that God raised Jesus physically from the dead. A resurrection would be a miracle, and as such would defy all probability. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a miracle. To say that an event that defies probability is more probable than something that is simply improbable is to fly in the face of anything that involves probability. Of course, it's not likely that someone innocently moved the body, but there's nothing inherently improbable about it. Of course, it's unlikely that one of Jesus's followers stole the body and then lied about it, but, well, people do wrong things all the time and lie about it. Even religious people, even people who become religious leaders.
As you can see, Ehrman does not ridicule the theory in any way, shape, or form. In fact, he even states there isn't anything inherently wrong with the theory, despite how unlikely it is. Habermas is right that Ehrman is still appealing to Humean rhetoric, but nowhere in the index in his book will you find Hume to be cited, as Habermas claims he has. In fact, here are two clips, one where Ehrman states in his interview with Alex O'Connor that he hasn't even read Hume, and another where Ehrman proves that by completely misrepresenting Hume in his debate with William Lane Craig.
You know, I don't know if this was on your thing or not, but somebody last week was interviewing me and replaying some things where he was trashing me for some debate we had 20 years ago, where he said that, you know, the only reason I reject resurrection is because I've got some kind of warmed over Humean understanding of things, and I've never read Hume. You know, it's like, it is just so wrong. It's just like, it's just factually wrong.
I'm not talking about whether a miracle can happen. I don't accept Hume's argument that miracles can't happen.
So no, Gary, Ehrman is not at all doing or saying any of the things you claim. So, once again...
If you're going to say something, make sure you have the facts straight first.
I want to go, time out. If you don't have Hume, what does that do to your argument? The back of that volume 2, Frank, that you held up, the rust-colored one, there's an appendix on what's wrong with naturalism. And I cite a number of naturalists, prominent naturalists, who say you can't prove naturalism's true. So here's my question. If you can't prove naturalism's true, how can that be my backdrop against rejecting miracles and saying the supernatural world is non-existent?
I think there's a conceptual misunderstanding here. Most naturalists aren't claiming that naturalism can be proven in the sense of absolute certainty. Rather, what's being expressed is a commitment to methodological naturalism, the principle that we interpret and investigate reality through natural causes because, to date, all reliable knowledges and confirmed events have consistently fallen within that domain. This doesn't mean we assert naturalism as metaphysically necessary or unbreakable. It means that, given the track record of our inquiries across history, testimony, science, and philosophy, the natural has been the only successful explanatory backdrop. No verified event has ever clearly violated this pattern. That pattern itself becomes a kind of empirical bedrock. Here's where Hume's insight matters. When someone proposes an event that contradicts all past experiences, namely a miracle, it's not that we dismiss it outright, but that the evidential bar is justifiably high. The probability that all our past understanding of reality has been overturned is weighed against the probability of error in perception, testimony, or inference. As Hume said, a wise man proportions his beliefs to the evidence. So it's not that we dogmatically rule out miracles because we've proven naturalism true, it's that our entire framework of understanding is built on the success of natural explanations, and until something demonstrably breaks the pattern with stronger evidence than the total weight of past experience, skepticism is the most rational position. We don't say a miracle didn't happen, we say, given what we know, it's far more likely that something else occurred. That's how we responsibly use naturalism as a backdrop, not because it's a metaphysical certainty, but because it's the most successful inference we have. Thank you for watching Anchorless. I love you.